everyone, and welcome to our webinar on Navigating Change, the Destiny of Marketing in the CPG Landscape. My name is Lori Pugh, Director of Events Content and Strategic Engagement at the Path to Purchase Institute, and I'll be your moderator for today. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We plan to leave time at the end to answer some of your questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions over the next hour. And you'll find that on the left side of your screen below the video feed. If we don't have time to answer all of your questions, we'll do our best to have someone follow up after the session concludes. You can also use that section on the bottom left if you have any technical issues, and our webinar producer will assist you. And if you'd like to review this discussion later or share it with a colleague, a replay will be made available within about 2 hours of conclusion today. So you can come right back to the same page in which you had originally registered and listen to it again. And it will remain available for 90 days. So that's it for housekeeping. So let me frame up our webinar for today. We'll discuss effective management of marketing strategy changes and communication across departments, including strategies for bridging gaps between teams and utilizing agencies, software, and AI in change management. Our speakers today are Bradley Kiefer, CRO at Keen Decision Systems, Drake Stimson, partner, the Partnering Group, and Glenn Cyborowski, Senior Analytics Manager at Bush Brothers and Company. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bradley to get us started.
Great, and thank you for the opportunity. I thank the Path to Purchase Institute for hosting us today. I've really brought in two folks who I've come to admire in the industry to join me, and alongside of Keen. So Keen is a 14-year-old company that's focused on disrupting the way in which marketing mix has been done. As many of you know, marketing mix, oftentimes triggers folks of like marketing mix. That's that PowerPoint deck that I spent too much money and caused a lot of pain, putting together. And Keen is really disrupting that space with this always-on, future-looking, revenue forecasting, marketing, media optimization, planning solution. So we're really that SaaS tool that's disrupting a consulting industry. And, really what we're finding in the industry today is that there's a lot of trouble implementing marketing mix and moving faster. So like folks desire to get the answers that a tool like Keen can, really deliver, which is, what should I do, right? So I know my ROI is this, I know my ROAS is that, I know my brand plan, but am I building the right plans moving forward for marketing? Do I coordinate with the agency correctly? Is the agency doing what I asked them to do? So it's like all these challenges that are kind of swirling, and they're all swirling around marketing mix, because with cookies going away, everybody started with marketing mix 15 years ago, and then MTA was the magic solution that was going to solve everything. And then people realized it never actually solved what they thought it would. And now it's going away. So people are coming back like marketing mix is brand new, which for us presents an opportunity, which is like, it's not what you think it is. Like our CEO will say, like, it's not your grandmother's marketing mix, right? So it's like, it's not the same thing. But at the same time, the industry and CPG companies are going through these like dramatic transformations. And what we wanted to do is kind of put together a webinar that really helps folks to say like, well, what should I be doing? Like, how do I think about making smarter marketing decisions? How do I think about adopting SaaS in a consulting world? Like, how do I think about structuring my team the right way to actually utilize a unified marketing measurement solution? So recently we had conducted a CMO survey where we interviewed hundreds of CMOs and VPs of marketing across industries. A lot of them in CPG, but also in D2C and finance and banking and insurance, kind of across the board. And a couple of the things that emerged from that survey that we just produced, which will be available for anybody who's interested in as a follow-up, is we start to see these themes, which is 43% of CMOs have trouble tying marketing spend to revenue. And this is something we hear all the time. And we talk about this idea of like, how do we bridge the gap between ROAS and P&L? Because marketers are like, so focused on like, well, the agencies told me to talk about reach and frequency and all of these things. And yet when I talk internally, the CFO's like staring at me saying, but the spreadsheet doesn't reflect that performance. So like, I'm not sure where the disconnect is here, right? And 38% of CMOs, so they spent too much money on the wrong campaigns. But the reality is they identified that after they ran the campaigns and let them settle and all of that. So it's like we just wasted so much time and money hoping that it was right. In fact, I was talking to a CPG the other day who was using one of the traditional marketing mix players. And what they said was like, we tried this new creative because we thought we, targeted the right audience with this right message. And what we did was we ran that across all of our creative or all of our marketing channels. And then we waited for it to settle. And then we measured the results. And 6 months after we ran the campaign, we realized we just wasted $7 million because that message isn't actually resonating with the audiences. So we're not sure what to do about it. 50% of CMOs said they're spending too much money on the wrong tools. If there is not a shortage of things today, it is the fact that there's like 4,500 MarTech tools that exist today, just like there's data all over the place. So you have this like saturation of data, saturation of tools, you have all these things, and yet people are still making the wrong decision and not being able to tie it to what actually matters. So for us, I'm looking at this as an opportunity from Keen's perspective to say, we have all these new tools that are emerging. A tool like Keen that can unify trade and shopper and media and marketing, and like it can come to the table together, but yet the organizations aren't there. And when I say, hey, we're a multiplicative Bayesian regression model, and it's an econometric model, and here's why it doesn't eat cookies, people stare at me like, I don't know what that means, right? So what we're trying to see is like there's new tools that are emerging that can answer some of these key questions to fill this gap, but yet we don't have the right mindset or the right skill set or the right processes or the right organizational structures to support these tools. So from that, I really wanted to bring in Drake, who comes from the partnering group, and really start to look at this from a consulting perspective to say like, well, how should organizations think about implementing change? How should they think about structuring their teams? How should they think about process? And Keen has had the privilege of working with Bush Brothers over the last couple of years here. And really what we're finding is that like they get it, right? Like the Bush Brothers team is willing to say, through some of Glenn's leadership, through some of the marketing leadership, really coming to the table and saying like, how do we think about doing things differently? And, I wanted Glenn to be able to share some of the stories because, Drake can talk about the foundation and I can talk about the dream, but actually doing it is really complicated. So what we wanted to offer today during this session is really an opportunity to say like, how should we do it? Like, what should we think about differently? Because right now that marketing proof gap still exists and marketers are still having trouble connecting their spend to the P&L. In fact, there's articles all over the place. Starbucks is the latest of like, well, we're changing our CMO strategy. UPS did it a couple months ago and made a lot of noise around eliminating the CMO. We're seeing CMO shifting to CCO roles. We're seeing marketing budgets continue to get cut because it's like, well, we need to figure out a place to become more efficient. And CFOs often say, I've got an idea. Let's cut marketing because I don't know if it actually does anything for us anyway, right? And that struggle is not validated in the data. In fact, we find marketers or organizations that cut their marketing budgets or go dark like they did at COVID are spending 3.5 times the amount to regain that momentum because they cut marketing. So it's like that you cut off your nose to spite your face, right? It's like that's realizing, but they don't have a tool that can defend that decision. So really what we wanted to say is like, if that continues to happen, how do we build the right MarTech stack to tell the right story? So your budget stops getting cut, so your role stops getting cut. But at the same time, having the right tools needs to be supported by the right process, the right alignment internally. We also need marketers to be able to speak the language of finance, right? Like CFOs don't speak the language of reach and frequency and creative effectiveness. Those things don't mean anything to most finance folks. So like, how do you actually change the way you measure and change the way you talk about your role? Because CMOs are not just this like creative center of excellence anymore. They're really a hybrid role because marketing is a cost center, but it's a cost center that has the potential to make the biggest impact on your P&L if done correctly. Well, we don't say that as an industry, right? We don't have the tools or the talk track or the skill set to support that. And then at the same time, there's also that personal component, which is like, you just have to be able to embrace your ability as a CMO to be able to tell a story with data. And I come from a revenue generation or a sales background, and there's an industry standard out there called the challenger sale. And like, I love this concept of a challenger, which is like, well, let me just ask the questions we're all thinking out loud. Let me just say the things that might not be like collaborative, but yet it challenges the status quo, because it's hard, and it's hard to find that courage to be able to be that person that says like, actually, I feel like we're not efficient here. I feel like we're making the wrong decisions here. So we want to kind of talk through that. So that just want to tee that up, and again, start to bring in Drake and Glenn here to talk through like, all right, so all this sounds great. So what's your guys' perspective on the issues facing the industry today in regards to the CMO tenure or the shifting of roles? So Drake, what's your perspective on that coming in from the partnering group?
Yeah, we're certainly seeing this across our client base and outside of our client base. There's just increasing pressure on the P&L. And it's forcing the organizations, the marketing organizations, to better understand what's driving profitability. And the result of that is, the creative will always be an important part of the success of marketing, but there's an increasing importance on understanding the data, understanding the financial engine, how you drive profitability, and that cascades down into really understanding that total funnel and the roles that your marketing plans play within that funnel. And things like the Keen model and really agile marketing mix modeling enables you to really think through the phases of that funnel and tighten up the performance within that funnel. But there's a lot to implement this. The tool is one element, but there's a lot of follow-on work that's required.
So tell me a little bit about like what the partnering group is doing around like this change management, and then Glenn, yeah. I'd love to learn a little bit more as we go through this from you of like, how are you guys actually implementing and taking some of these learnings? So, Drake, let's talk through that a little bit more from a MarTech perspective.
Certainly. So, we've walked into a number of situations where a client has acquired a marketing mix modeling tool and felt like, okay, I've got the tool, I should be fine. But the reality is, a couple of things have to happen. One, you need to know how to use the tool, and it requires understanding those best practices to be successful with that tool. But it also requires change management. It means working with your agency in different ways. It means working within your organization in different ways. And particularly that connection, as you pointed out, Brad, between finance and marketing. It means learning how to speak the finance speak and helping the finance group understand the role of the marketing mix model and how it can help them make these choices. But, what we end up doing is helping our clients apply those best practices, help with that change management, but then very quickly working to deploy the model in ways that we can get some quick wins, right? So that it doesn't become this, hey, there's this annual event. We're going to look back and see how we did, and then we'll think about in a year doing another annual event. And part of our role is to help our clients be more agile and nimble. And what's great about the Keen model is the ability to use it in real time. And so what we encourage with our clients is this quarterly update to the marketing mix model so that it gives you some of that agility. You aren't waiting 6 months to look back and say, oops, we made a mistake. We're also working with our clients, given how robust the model is, working with our clients to help build a learning agenda. So as we look at the marketing mix model, there are a number of benefits. Certainly one is evaluating how your marketing mix is performing, but the other is enabling these tests throughout the year to fuel future improvements. So it's not just looking at our primary focus today, but it's preparing for a better marketing mix tomorrow by setting up a very clear learning agenda and then making sure you're funding against that learning agenda. We typically encourage our clients to take about 8 to 10% of their marketing budget and dedicate it to that learning agenda, so that with these quarterly intercepts in the marketing mix model analysis, we're able to look at the results from that learning agenda to improve going forward. So it's a little bit more complex than it's been in the past, versus that one-time event. But the results of the benefits of being more agile are dramatic. And that's really where you see the fastest improvement in ROI. So that's a little bit of
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
we're working with our clients.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think if we build off of that, like one of the things that we often see, Drake, as we come together, whether a client is working. So I saw a question come in, like whether a client is working, self-service, where like they're doing all the media buying in-house, marketing in-house, or whether it's like, well, I've got 18 agencies that do 18 different channels. Like we see the entire spectrum. Part of what we start with is like, oh, maybe you don't need 18 agencies. Let's kind of narrow that down to one or two, because there was this like instance, in the industry where I was like, well, we need to diversify and have them compete against each other. And it's like, actually, that ends up costing you more because you don't allow the interactions to take place between the execution. And good luck trying to say you're creative and you sound like the same company across Meta versus your CTV ads, because it's two different agencies running them or generating the creative. But one of the bigger things that we see is like, when I started an engagement, I always like to ask brands, like, what are you trying to achieve? And it's like deer in the headlights sometimes of like, what's the 3-year plan? Like,
Right.
what are you guys actually trying to achieve? Because I can build the greatest marketing mix model in the world. And if it's like, to do what? And it's like, oh, I don't know. We just want to sell more stuff. And it's like, well, that's not a plan. That's not a strategy. So let's talk a little bit more of, Drake, from your perspective, as you kind of get into these conversations of this change management. And then Glenn, a little bit of how like Bush Brothers has approached this, like, how critical is building the right strategy, or at least like all being on the same page, because fragmentation is very real in this industry.
Yeah, Brad, there's a lot to unpack there. Two elements. One is the data itself. Increasingly, there is greater power in owning the data yourself. So we're seeing clients bring in-house some of the buying that used to be external, and that's ultimately up to the client and their commitment and investment. But regardless of whether they own directly all the data or the agencies are still buying the media, one of the critical elements is getting pipes to that data and making sure that those pipes are piping in the right data and the right format. So that's one piece of it. But the other piece is the strategy and thinking about, again, that consumer journey and the funnel from top to bottom, and understanding that you might want to think about the roles of your different marketing elements in different ways. In other words, there are certain elements where it would make sense to have a lower ROI because strategically that's the right thing to do. It's just you're doing it because of some strategic priority that you've established on the business. Whereas in other cases, let the best ROI win. And I agree with you. We have seen over the past decade sort of this burgeoning complexity of media platforms, and some of our clients have, played, as you've suggested, the game of having multiple agencies work on different elements, and that's fine. It's harder, frankly. Ultimately, I think it's more expensive. But at some point, someone on the brand in the marketing group needs to really understand, be that integration point, and understand, well, we're doing these elements to achieve this end. And I've got a very clear sense of what the KPIs are to evaluate that performance. And again, we're tracking it on a continuous basis to make sure that we don't, get too far away from success, right? I mean, we need to course correct. We've got to have the feedback to be able to course correct. And so at any rate, I think more and more our marketers are burdened by the complexity, but that, the different media vehicles, although those media vehicles open up other doors that we haven't had available in the past. And so consequently, you really need to be smarter about why are you doing this and how will you evaluate it?
Yeah, and I think the adoption of AI and probabilistic forecasting,
Sure.
pushes us away from, a measurement only mindset, which I think one of the things is like, not just aligning on the business strategy, but Glenn, I remember a conversation you and I had, I think last time I was in your headquarters, is really around like, maybe the challenge is that you have the wrong KPIs. Like for a tool that enables a forward-looking optimization, for a tool that enables, forecasting within a 4% margin of error that could be translated and integrated with your supply chain, and like making sure that marketing, while it's amazing, it's not driving people to an empty shelf. It's like maybe having an ROI benchmark isn't the right KPI, right? Because from an econometric perspective, it's like, I can make your ROI higher. Do you know how? You just spend less, right? It's like, that's the point of diminishing return concept. So I think we also need to have the KPI conversation. So, Glenn, tell us a little bit more about like, Bush Brothers and like some of the realization that you guys have had to come to now that you have a tool like Keen, and how you've had to have these strategy conversations.
Yeah. So Keen really has us drinking from the fire hose in terms of the amount of business processes that it illuminated for us. And you can get pointed in all sorts of different directions really quick. But typically when there's a lot of complexity, a simple solution of just kind of raising your hand and saying, hey, what are we trying to achieve here? What are the goals and strategies? So some of the initial decisions we made were, how should we think about, how should we segment our business? So we've aligned on 4 segments. We have baked, we have chili beans, we have sidekicks, which is a newer platform, and our recipe beans. And we're starting to realize that it's okay for 4 different segments to have 4 different goals and strategies. So we can start to break that down a little bit and say which metrics best serve which of our segments. Are we trying to grow top line? Are we trying to grow bottom line? Or are we achieving volumetric goals here, where we're trying to get new products in the hands of consumers? And then over which time horizon are we operating? Is this something that needs to happen in the next 12 months? Is this something that needs to happen in 1 or 2 years? Or is this a long-term initiative that we have? And when we think about our marketing tactics, we flagged which one of those are short-term and which one of those are long-term. And we pull those levers in different ways to produce different outputs.
Yeah, that really highlights a pretty unique differentiator for Keen, really, is this idea of like, Keen is by default focused on building long-term, sustainable, profitable organizations. That's different from most platforms that exist, right? Most platforms that are out there are looking at like 30 or 60-day ROAS metrics, where Keen truly believes in the power of quantifying forward-looking marketing. And we do it through our long-term multi-year decay rates, through our ad stock rates, through some of the half-life conversations that we have. But it's really like we're actually quantifying that long-term impact. So when Glenn says like, hey, we want to drive toward long-term profitability over the next 3 years, we can have a different model for that, right? So it's not just like, here's your same model and we're just going to apply a 1.25% multiplier to every channel and call that long-term impact. So it's a really unique way of looking at marketing. Yeah, I think in addition to that, so like we talk about strategy, the other thing is process, right? So, if we think about the questions that we ask from a process or a strategy perspective, or a sales or a marketing strategy perspective, it also comes down to like, so how will we do it, right? So what are the questions that we have to ask ourselves, is, Drake alluded to, is like data. Like data is a huge problem today across the entire industry, not just CPG, but also in all the industries we work with, which is like, where is the data, right? Agencies aren't typically sitting there saying like, I'm collecting this data on a recurring basis and I'm tagging it the right way for the sake of inputting into marketing mix. No, everything's campaign audience tagging. There's no naming nomenclature. So it's like, we oftentimes will be like, well, get us data on Meta, and we'll be dumped over this spreadsheet that's like, well, campaign P743. And it's like, I don't even know what that means. And they're like, I don't either, because that was like the other girl who used to work here. And then this guy has a spreadsheet on his desktop. And it's just like, so we're starting to see this rise of like, well, do we use a tool like tracer.tech or TapClicks or some kind of tool to like build API pipes into our data Rama or, into our data lake? So like, who owns the data? Like, how do we feed that into a model? Like, if we think about measurement, am I measuring based off of top line or bottom line? Am I building a plan that actually achieves what we want as a holistic company? Because again, another unique differentiator for Keen is this ability to look at a portfolio that says, well, brand X is focused on profitability. Brand Y is focused on driving revenue. If I feed those two brands separately the right way with the right mix, looking at the interactions and halos between them, I can actually drive the category and drive the brand and achieve the objective. Well, right now it's hard. Like there's no models that exist like that. Everything is like, I'm looking at Meta's performance in a vacuum against Google's performance in a vacuum. And if I add up all of my ROASs, my business should be 4 times bigger than it is, right? And it's like, so how do we bring those together to look at the interaction effects? And then, the other thing, Drake, I think we should talk about here from an execution perspective is like, I can build the greatest forward-looking media plan, but like, do you have the creative ready? Do you have the timing ready? Who's actually going to pull the trigger to do it? So how do you guys think about execution, right? So whether it's, Glenn on your side or Drake, some of the best practices that you've seen is, introducing quarterly updates are only as impactful as the ability to actually execute off of the insight coming out of the quarterly update. So what are your thoughts on that, Drake?
Yeah, a couple things. I think it does get back to you have to have a strategy. You have to have a plan. You have to know what role each of the products play in that plan and what role each of the marketing elements play in that plan. And you've got to have the humility to recognize that maybe everything you're going to execute from a creative perspective may not be perfect. But you've got to have the confidence to know that you can set up plans to dramatically improve the performance of those ads and the creative elements over time. And that's candidly, that's sort of a flip. We see a lot of folks that this is the right thing to do, and they go off and execute it, and it becomes this cascade event. And then they wait till later down the road to evaluate it. And we're really encouraging our clients to think of it a little bit differently and kind of build over time the investment behind those creative pieces as they learn and get confidence that it's right and they maybe have optimized it. But I do think it begins with thinking through what must be true for us to win. We've defined the win. And then what are the elements and roles that each play? I think there's another piece to this too, an underpinning, which you've hit on, Brad, which is the data. You need to have a data strategy. And you can't just turn it over to the agencies or external partners to just hope that you're going to get the data. And it's not just about collecting data in the right way and making sure that the data is harmonized. It's also understanding how is that data going to help you strategically? How is it going to help you win? What role does the data play in winning as well? And that'll expand how you think about the data, and you're going to do a better job of managing it and owning it. But typically where we're working with our clients is on the strategic thinking through the plans, what must be true, the roles, and then making sure they've got a data strategy to support the whole strategy.
Yeah, and that's where, apologies to the audience for this weird formatted. It must have in the transition, the formatting got weird, but it's really this idea of like, how do we map out the flow of data, Drake, to your point of like, so what are all the different medias, right? So who's got my CTV? Who owns it? Who owns that data? Who owns the process? Where's my metadata? How's that getting in there? And oftentimes what Keen is really, kind of looking to build is, it's almost like we're trying to build a CRM, but for marketing, right? And marketing decision-making is like, well, how do we get all the data to flow in an automated way? Whether it's, through a Datarama integration, whether it's directly from a tool like a partner that Keen has, like with Sky, or whether it's a partner like TapClicks, it's like, how do we get data that's normalized, aggregated, and then put into Keen's data warehouse that lives inside of our application to be able to measure, to be able to then bring in ROAS or any kind of metric that informs the priors, one of the benefits of Bayesian, but then exports into those automated bidding and buying platforms? Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is like, I want to build almost like a headless, MarTech stack of like automated decision-making. Like that's where the industry's going. But the reality is in order to get there, we need to put the right MarTech players together, and we need to assume that there's brands that are ready to have a data mapping conversation. So Glenn, how do you guys at Bush Brothers think about, this data mapping process, the accountability process, the execution process?
Yeah, so I think that part of the mindset is progress over perfection. The world is always changing. It's never going to be perfect. And as soon as you can wrap your mind around, hey, how do we get a little bit better each day? How do we get a little bit better from one week to the next? And we talk a lot about the 3 puts. There's input, there's throughput, and then there's output. So the first piece, inputs, that hits on the data collection narrative that we've been talking about. And step one was breaking up, how do we want to group our business? What are our segments? Then what are all of the demand levers or factors that we need to consider in how we run our business? What levers do we control or influence? And then what are some external factors that we need to be aware of? What is our share within the category? Is it growing or shrinking? What's happening with price? And defining all of those pieces. And starting to establish very clear owners of who owns what. So I think we have over 100 lever segment combinations that we have documented that says, hey, these agency partners are responsible for these inputs. Some of the finance or the trade, those are internal folks that help us bring those data points into the model. And then we also have added a step where our brand managers are responsible for validating the inputs. So to your point earlier, everyone's moving, oh, that was somebody did that 3 years ago. We still have a brand manager that's responsible for the continuity and validating these inputs over time. It's not sexy right now. It's still a very manual process, but we're leaning into that, and it gives us time to ask questions. We've gone through a couple refreshes now, and we continue to tease out nuances of like, well, hey, we grouped it like this before, but there's actually a short and long-term benefit to grouping our levers differently. So going slow allows for time for people to ask questions and really hone in those filters. Are we getting everything we need, or do we need to define things a little bit differently? In addition to data collection, this is where you start to get into the forward-looking aspects of Keen. So part of it is our ability to measure things that we can't measure in other parts of our measurement ecosystem. So how do we digest, how do we get this historical look of, oh, our eyes are open now. This is how those investments have been performing for us. And then it gets into the forward-looking decision-making around, what are the goals? Are we maximizing profitability? Are we trying to optimize our budget? Are we trying to forecast a plan? And each of those is a different business process that requires different inputs, and revisiting that conversation of, okay, who owns the budget? What version is it? How many iterations has it gone through? And then finally thinking about the outputs. And one of the first steps in output was defining our business calendar. Hey, what internal business processes exist? Is it quarterly board meetings? Is it annual plans? Is it monthly S&OP? Where do we best fit the output that we're creating? And how do we need to speak about the business? Goes back to the point I was mentioning earlier. Is this top line, bottom line? Is it short, medium, long term? And making sure that when we get an audience and we're ready to share our insight, that we're delivering the right message based on the processes that we've run.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think one of the challenges that came in through one of the questions that was asked was around, like, you know, how do we structure the data, right? So someone wrote in the chat that it's like, we've been working on this data mapping, data governance, like for 2 years, and it's still like, so you have to balance the, you know, if I don't do some of the work, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out. With what we would say is, like, let's start with like the macro mix. Like I always talk about, like, let's do it in phases, right? I can always get to be insanely granular, but I want to ask you the first question and challenge you as a marketer to say, like, do you even have the right dollars in the right buckets? So like having the right campaign data mapped perfectly and tagged perfectly before it's like, I bet you're overspending at the bottom of the funnel because the retailers are making you do it in retail media. You're probably overspending in trade. It's impacting your P&L. You're not spending enough at the top of the funnel in brand. And I know that because, like, we see it in like 99% of the brand models that we build, because the industry has followed the trend of the shiny new platform. And, you know, we're always held hostage to the retailers, right? It feels like it's just like, well, they told me I have to spend more to get this favorability. And it's like, and I didn't have anything to battle them back in my joint business planning session. So I just said, okay, with a little bit of negotiation. So like, how do we bring those concepts together of like, how perfect does data need to be? And maybe, Glenn, this is part of a discovery that you guys have had of like, you could spend all of your time making the data perfect, but it's like, define what that even means, versus like, let's lift that up a little bit. Let's make sure, do we have the right amount in like top of the funnel versus bottom of the funnel before we look at like campaign optimization? How do we find that balance, in the garbage in, garbage out with the right macro mix? And when's the right time to actually execute? What is your take on that, Glenn?
Yeah, I think a couple things that come to mind is this is a journey. So that whole illumination process of you kind of don't know what you don't know until you get your hands dirty. And then really perfection is the enemy of good. And how do you start to just put one foot in front of the other? When we wired this thing up over a year ago, there were some pieces of data that got missed. There were some pieces of data that were captured incorrectly. And we celebrate those wins and we reframe them as opportunities. Oh, here's an opportunity for us to get better. A good example would be we have a cable TV lever and we have an SEC sponsorship. And part of the SEC sponsorship is advertising on the SEC network. And there were examples of in that data collection process that where the investment level and the impression level were kind of getting muddled together. So we were able to kind of tease that out and ask different questions around like, is our investment in the SEC sponsorship working for us? But going through and cleaning those up, teasing those out over time. And then also really throttling back. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew. In each of these quarterly refreshes, what are our opportunities to get a little bit better? And what are the things that we really want that we really may not have the appetite to bite off right now? And just tabling those as, hey, that can be part of quarterly refresh number 4 in the future, but here's how we're getting better today. And really keeping that type of frame of mind of getting better from one week to the next.
Yeah, no, and that's excellent. So as we kind of continue through this and what we've learned, what we've discovered together, Glenn, as two folks working together, and then Drake, as you see these industry trends, like the other piece that still continues to emerge is this ability for marketers to speak in the language of finance and embracing the new role. It's not that CMOs are different people at this point. It's that there's a different skill set that's needed. Whether through training, whether through a different profile, through a different persona, through adding resources. So, what's your take, Drake, as we go into this of like how the CMO role has evolved and, what is the importance of a CMO or a marketing team to being able to speak the language of finance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the CMO role is pretty diverse. There's internal capabilities and there are a whole host of responsibilities, but ultimately it's really important to have the frame of perspective that the purpose of marketing is to drive sales and profitability. Like that's why you exist. And so then it's a question of how do you get there? And, what we've learned as practitioners and as, supporting our clients, just getting the finance team and the marketing team in the same room together to understand the engine of profitability for a brand, right? That isn't going to contaminate the creativity of the group. It's going to actually help inform the marketing team in terms of understanding, well, gosh, knowing that this is really the profit center for our business, maybe I should rethink about what I'm marketing and how I'm marketing it. And conversely, for the finance team, helping them understand not just the economics of the marketing plan, but how the marketing plan works to build profitability over time. So really, truly getting them in the same room, it can be eye-opening for both groups. And that's, I think, frankly, one of the critical components. And getting our marketing teams to be thinking about, look, you're a business leader and you need to understand the business. And ultimately, that does translate to the financials. How are we making money? Yeah,
and so my background's all in startup software, so like this is absolutely critical in the startup world, right? It's easier to tell the story because I'm not starting with all the baggage of legacy industry, problems, or I'm not starting with all the baggage of like how we've always done things. But one thing that we always talk about in the startups software world is really like how do we create stability to create predictability, to create scale, right? And the way that we do that is really through the way in which we go to market. It's this idea of like, could I spend and, grow at the rate at which some of these like West Coast startups spend in what we deem to be an irresponsible way of just spending to spend? And then it's like, hey, I went public and my stock crashed because like it's not actually a real business. It's just like, it's still burning cash at the level at which it is. And it's like, to me, that's just like a fundamental economic issue that exists within our culture. But it's like, and we're not going to change that, right? I think that's a follow-up podcast, right? It's like that conversation. But you see some of that kind of bleed into the rest of the CPG industry and some of these other industries with marketing, is this idea that like, you've forgotten that you are a cost center, but you're a cost center that can impact scale and profitability, right? And part of it is like there hasn't been a tool that's understood that long-term tying in your P&L. And that's where I think we see this unique differentiation is like, one, I can show how stability, even in the midst of a very unstable environment economically, can become an option. Sometimes it means spend more. Sometimes it means spend less. It really comes back to that strategic, conversation and understanding your P&L. And an example of that on one side is a challenger brand that we work with that's kind of coming in, disrupting, building a category. And, they started working with us with this mindset of like, we need to grow like a hockey stick. Like it's all just like scale and growth. And that all sounds really good, right? But then things happen in the economy. And all of a sudden, in Challenger, when you're building a new category, the big guys come along with bigger paycheck or with bigger checkbooks, and they say, hang on a second, let me play in that game, right? Well, it shifts the conversation, right? So it really comes back to, do we have to hockey stick, or can we actually ride the coattail of the big guys who are going to just throw dollars at the category? So now instead of creating a category, I can pivot, cut my marketing, and ride the coattail of the category, which one, I was a part of building that momentum, but two, the big guys kind of lead, and that's okay, right? So for this brand, they actually were able to drop their investment, and this has been pretty consistent. This is old enough data now that I feel comfortable sharing it, is like they're continuing to cut their investment because they don't need to spend it. It's not because their budget is getting cut. It's because they figured out a way to drive greater profitability rather than spending for the sake of spending, because like I have to spend through the headwind sometimes, but other times there's a tailwind that emerges. At the same time, we work with like big legacy brands who are trying the traditional approach, which is like, how do I optimize for each of these brands in isolation? So I used a traditional marketing mix guy. They did my brand A, brand B, brand C, and then we tried to cobble them together. Well, all these brands are in the same category. So what our model was able to do through the portfolio is to say, like, actually, if you spend this way, you can drive the category. The halo to each of the brands will be effective. I'm going to spend on this brand D that you weren't going to spend on because it's like, well, it's a seasonal product. It's a commoditized product. I don't really need to spend it. And it's like, actually, you can. And overall, what we found is that we're able to lift not only the impact of the media, but the profitability driven by the aggregate, right? So this is that P&L conversation. So rather than just being a brand manager's problem, this is now a corporate problem that we can solve that says, can I actually drive, by balancing the performance of each of these brands in a well-balanced way, the growth that we want and the profitability that we want? So Glenn, as you start to think about like the work that you talked about earlier of like getting folks in the same room and like having people like think about the timing and impact, how do you guys think about this ability to speak the language of finance and kind of build that bridge?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind is I'll never forget that moment when we turned on Keen and we finally start getting some of these like historical visibility for the first time. And then two, the ability to generate forward-looking plans. And when you look at how we had historically gone to market with a one big pulse and then another big pulse and then taking a break in the middle, and then you overlay Keen's more of like an always on strategy. And we were like, well, we can't go from what we've been doing and immediately follow this model. So how can we test and learn our way into it? So part of the concept or the soundbite that got played was, well, when I look at my investment over time, I could probably say there's months or two that are overinvested and I can trim that back a little bit. Or maybe there's a tactic where I'm overinvested and I can dial it back. But there's probably a month or a tactic that I'm not using at all. and I could reap higher ROIs on just shifting some of the investment from my over investments into places where I'm not making investment. And that's where the concept of raise the floors and lower the ceilings came from. And if we were strategic in kind of making those optimizations, it sounds almost mechanical in talking about the process of making optimizations, but that's, you got to start pedaling on the bike at some point. Two, we kind of just say nobody can whistle a symphony. It's going to take the whole orchestra to play it. And what we mean by that is that's where we have collaborative meetings with our Keen representative, our agency representatives, trade, and marketing. We're all in the room together, looking at the same screens, asking different types of questions. But we feel confident if we have that right cocktail of people and we're maintaining and leveraging those relationships, then we can probably say, hey, we all can figure out what's the combination of short and long-term trade and marketing to get the arrows moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and that's really key. It's one thing that we see pretty consistently across, a lot of the industry, which is, I overspend in seasonal periods and dramatically underspend in seasonal periods. And what that actually means from a data perspective is I killed all of my momentum for 3 months and then had to spend my way back into momentum. Well, that's not profitability, right? So that is yes, I'm driving units sold at what cost, right? Because when you have to lower the ceiling, basically what you mean is yeah, it's not horrible, but it's not as optimal as it could be, right? So we find that it's instead of going dark, keep more of an always on with a definite seasonal impact where it's maybe I'm spending 20% of what I work with a soup company and it's well, we go dark. It's but people eat soup all year, don't they? It's well, yeah, but we influence more people in the winter. And it's sure, but more people eat soup in the winter because it's cold. So it's they're already going to come to you. So maybe you don't have to spend as much. You should spend more in that down period trying to fill that revenue lull and saying, can we lift it? You're not going to lift it to the same level as the winter in that example. And I think you guys have something similar in that seasonal period. More people eat beans when they're grilling, right? It's just a thing, right? So the question is but people eat beans all year. But they're not going to eat as many as they eat in the summertime. So why are you going dark when that's also true? So it's finding that right balance from a week to week perspective is really important, and doing it from a profitability perspective. And then Drake, as we go into this final section, I was going to say, what other thoughts do you have to kind of close out that section? And then as we go into how do you actually tell that story? How do you drive that change?
Well, I think Glenn has done some really great work here. And one of the elements that we work with our clients is you built this marketing plan. It ties to a business strategy. There are critical assumptions baked into it. We ought to test those assumptions. For example, the seasonality component. And so, that learning agenda is just as important as the strategy that you put in place, because if you want to improve, you've got to have a clear sense and a plan to get you the data that you need to learn what would improve the performance of the plan. So just wanted to close the loop on it, because that really, it highlights the importance of a learning agenda. It highlights the importance of defining the assumptions in the plan, which are sometimes so assumed that you don't even recognize them. And it's really important to make them explicit, not just implicit.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect tee up even for this last section, which is how do you have the confidence to be able to say, I'm willing to challenge the status quo that says, I'm a toy company. We always go dark in the summer because all of our sales come at Christmas time. It's sure. But that takes courage. It takes the right tool. It takes the ability to know how to speak the right language. It comes back to business fundamentals, right? It's I think sometimes we've forgotten the business fundamentals because we're so caught up in the status quo of how we've always carried these assumptions, how we've always talked about things as an organization. But yet at the same time, they'll say, but it's a different world we live in. And it's right. So therefore, why are you talking the same way, carrying the same assumptions? It is a different world, right? So how do we find that balance here to be able to, one, tell the story using a model, collecting the data to be able to tell that story, but then actually being able to deliver the story? And this is where it's really a story of collaboration as well as a story of courage, I think, right? Is this ability to say what Glenn's talking about. where one of the things that Keen always recommends is you guys work for the same team. And I think so many organizations are so siloed that it's like, well, no, I can't have that conversation. I'm the trade guy and I need to defend my dollars to the death. And then it's like the marketing team is over here saying the same thing. And it's like, well, trade's getting overspent and I could do magic with those. It's like, guys, you're on the same team. And like, there's so many times that we as a third party tool that has a unified option that says, I really feel like you guys need to solve the first problem, which is why don't we all sit around the same table and have a conversation? Because it's not about me defending my e-com retail media dollars and you defending your trade and shopper dollars. And it's like, what is best for the brand? And I know that sounds a little like kumbaya utopian, but it's like, it's a business fundamental, right? So it comes down to this like organizational structure piece, which, I'm sure Drake and the partner group spends a lot of time talking about it. We did a podcast with one of their associates and, kind of talk through like, what is the organizational structure of today? Does retail media, like, is it commerce? Is it marketing? Is it trade? Is it like, what is it? Like, how do we have the right structure? But, like, it's not about like, let's just put people around the same table and have a conversation about it, but be able to actually challenge the status quo. And, success doesn't come from convincing everyone to think the same way. It comes from creating that constructive conflict and productive tension. It's a quote from the Challenger sale that I absolutely love, which is this idea that like, I'm not trying to be a jerk. What I'm trying to say is like, the world is different and maybe we've lost our way a little bit, or maybe we're so stuck in the status quo that like, let's just reset. Do we have the same vision of the brand strategy? Do we have the same sales strategy? Like, what is the way that myself and my team can interact with the rest of the teams to be able to have a collaborative conversation? So, Glenn, as we kind of wrap up here, and then Drake, as we wrap up, what are your guys' final thoughts on or encouragement to folks listening to say, how do we embrace the new normal, utilizing tools and data in a different way to actually drive businesses forward?
Yeah, so the last 2 points that I want to talk about are around collaboration and different forms of collaboration. Wednesday afternoons, we have 1 hour where we get a bunch of people in the room and the team talks about Keen and this ongoing process. It's probably the thing I'm most proud of is we've got 25 people in a room. Agencies are dialing in. We have baked chili sidekicks all sitting at the table at the same time. We have marketing and trade people all sitting at the table at the same time, data folks, finance folks, and it just creates a different conversation. And I'm really proud that we've all kind of bought into, hey, I don't really know what I'm doing yet, but we're all committed to figuring it out together. Because in a way, I envision at some point, chili's seasonality problem is going to be very similar to the baked seasonality problem. And how can chili and baked learn from each other of here's how I optimize my in-season campaigns. And building a sidekicks business might not be that different from building an out-of-season baked bean business. And you made that point, Brad, earlier around like, well, people probably eat more baked beans when they're grilling in the summer. Yes, that's true. But how can we get to how can we get people to eat baked beans at Thanksgiving and Christmas? That looks very similar as building the sidekicks brand. And when one set of the team kind of starts moving in a direction, just keeping everyone informed from 1 week to the next, because there is so much learning happening. The other benefit of having 25 people in the room at the same time is we can create small breakouts and work on multiple parts of the process from 1 week to the next. So I sent the agenda out for today's meeting, and we have groups that are working on our next quarterly refresh and aligning all of our filters and groupings and all that stuff. We have other people who are scenario planning is kind of reaching an end. We have other scenarios that are kicking off, and we have new segments that we have aspirations of turning on in the future. So we can leverage that whole team and share learnings with each other. And that's really the secret sauce. I mean, without people and without managing relationships and collaborating, Keen is just a tool that helps kind of bring all that stuff into life. And then you get to the data and the process and some of the other points we've made this morning.
Yeah, so Drake, I would ask you to any final comments on this piece from the partnering group perspective on how to embrace these kind of tools and really have the courage to speak out for change.
Yeah, it's a good question. At the end of the day, the senior leadership team needs to declare what's important and declare that, look, we're here as a common business for a common end, and then define the role of something like the Keen marketing mix model in that effort. So, one, it begins with the commitment of senior management, push down. As Glenn has pointed out, I think critically is the process, defining that process and the collaboration along the process. And thirdly, which is really what Keen brings, is this agnostic tool that basically, we don't have to debate. The number is the number. Now, the question is, how do we improve it? And then again, that leads to your strategy and your learning agenda, which is, again, that really critical process. But I think leadership declaring the importance, the mandate, creating that process that involves that integration of the different functions, and then having the data, the hard data, so that you remove the debate, right? We need to kind of get past hand waving and get into, okay, what am I going to do now? How am I going to beat this number?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the conversation, Glenn and Drake. Appreciate Lori and the team at Path to Purchase for the opportunity to speak. But if you leave with anything, I think the embracing of AI and predictive technology is going to disrupt the way in which we do business. But tools are only as good as the people and the process and the skills and the training that you put around it. We've seen some tremendous success in the last 15 years as an organization, and really over the last 5 years as the industry has embraced utilizing software instead of like traditional PowerPoint marketing mix models. So that rise of AI, the adoption of faster decision making, it's time for a pretty large transformation as an organization to make smarter, more profitable decisions and get back to building sustainable and profitable brands. So I appreciate the time and the opportunity. Thank you all for listening. Our contact information is on the screen, and I appreciate the opportunity. So Lori, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bradley, Drake, and Glenn. We appreciate your time and your thought leadership today. And now, for those of you in the audience that submitted questions that we weren't able to get to because we ran out of time, don't worry. We're going to reach out to you individually and we'll get those questions answered. And I also want to take this time to let you know that we have an event coming up. We have Future Forward in Philadelphia. We hope you'll be joining us. And finally, thank you to all of you who are watching today. Thank you for the time that you spent with us. We'll be sending out a satisfaction survey, so let me know what topics you would like to see in the future. And remember that this webinar will be available on demand, so you can listen to it again, or you can share it with your colleagues. So that covers everything. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you back here again very soon.